Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the gift of self-compassion this holiday season. I'm Calvin Hu with Family Caregiver Alliance, and before we get started, I'd like to say a few words about our organization. Family Caregiver Alliance has been working in the Bay Area and also kind of across the nation to improve the well-being of family caregivers and also their quality of life. And we offer support by providing a number of services and resources, most at no cost. And these include consultations, classes, workshops, publications, and we also do advocacy work locally and nationally. To learn more about us, Family Caregiver Alliance, please visit our website, caregiver.org. So your phones and mics are going to be muted for this presentation. So if you have any questions, you can ask them by using the chat box on your screen. And we'll be asking that to Roy at the end of the presentation. And I'll be also asking you to provide a little bit of feedback at the end of the webinar, and I'd like to thank you all in advance for filling that out. So today I'd like to welcome our guest, Roy Reamer. He is the Zen Caregiving Project Executive Director. Roy has been an end-of-life caregiver and educator since 1997. He's trained with the Zen Hospice Project to become a volunteer and served at the bedside for 6 years at the guest house facility before serving 7 years on San Francisco's Laguna Honda Hospital's palliative care ward. Now, Roy is a practitioner in the Soto Zen tradition and is a student at the San Francisco Zen Center. He's certified by the Stanford University School of Medicine, Center for Compassion and Altruism Research Education, and also the Compassion Institute as a compassion cultivation training instructor. So now that you know a little bit more about our guest, I'd like to turn things over to Roy.
Great. Thank you, Calvin. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you today in the midst of this holiday season. And it feels like a really appropriate time to talk about self-compassion and kindness towards oneself. Caregiving can be a really wonderful experience and really challenging under any circumstances. But during the holidays, when there's so much going on and so much can come up for us, self-compassion is a wonderful tool to be able to apply in the midst of our lives to support us and to actually find some comfort amidst the things that can come up during the holidays. So many family caregivers, and this may describe you, are often feeling pretty isolated in their role. So they may feel confined to a home, caring for their loved one. They may feel as though they don't really have as much freedom to be out there in the world, to meet with friends, even meet with family. In this time of COVID, it's making everything even more difficult. And whereas in years past, perhaps you've traveled to see family, this year you may not feel like you're able to do that. And if you're anything like me, when the holidays come up, a lot of emotions and memories can get triggered. And so we may feel a certain longing for the way things once were during the holiday season. And we may feel some regret or discomfort on how things are different these days or this year. And when we're entertaining during the holidays, we can feel increased pressure, preparing meals or, buying gifts for people, showing up for the activities around the holidays. And, this can add more burden to our already busy lives. And the holidays, let's face it, they come with some financial burdens as well, which can create additional stress. So it can be a beautiful time, but it can be a really difficult time. So this tool of self-compassion can be really, really useful. So what do we mean when we talk about compassion. What I'd like to do is talk about compassion somewhat generally, and then really get into self-compassion as an aspect of compassion, compassion directed towards oneself. Um, we can go to the next slide. So, what is compassion? Well, compassion is really, in a literal sense, it's suffering with. So, the ability to be with someone else's suffering. So, this word compassion, the passion part, comes from, Judeo-Christian religious traditions, anyways, to mean suffering. And then the calm in front of it is really suffering. Is really with. So being with suffering. Next slide, please. So a definition that I really like a lot, and it's very simple, is when love meets suffering and love endures. So what this means really is that when we witness suffering happening around us, or even within ourselves, we don't turn away. We really develop the capacity to be with the suffering that we're seeing in another or in ourself. And we keep the heart open. The heart does not shut down. And this takes some practice. While compassion, I believe, is inherent, it's like a muscle. The more we use it, the stronger it gets. And so even if we have fallen away from compassion, we can get it back quite easily by simply cultivating the open heart, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. Next slide, please. So a favorite quote of mine is this. This comes from a local meditation teacher. If your compassion does not include yourself, it is incomplete. So this is where we begin to turn toward compassion for oneself. Next slide, please. Okay, so Kelvin, I'm going to ask you to go back 2 slides. I'm sorry, it seems as though one is missing, and I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, so another way to think of compassion is it's really a dynamic process, and there are 5 elements to this process of compassion. And I feel that it really helps to break it down in this way. So the first component of compassion is really awareness. So if we don't notice the compassion that's happening around us or within, then we're not going to experience compassion. So how do we develop more awareness? Well, this is where the practice of mindfulness comes in, and we'll come back to this in a moment, but there is the cognitive or affective element of being aware of the suffering that's happening around us or within. And then secondly, there's a very natural sympathetic concern that arises. So this is an emotional experience or really an affective experience where we see suffering, we have a response in the body, we experience empathy. So we're all humans, we've all suffered in our lives, we've struggled in different ways. And so when we see someone else struggling, we very naturally have an empathic response to that suffering. The best example of this is if you're walking down the street, maybe you see a child who's on a tricycle or something, and if they fall down, you might cringe, because we know what it feels like to hurt ourselves. And so that's really that empathetic response. And then very naturally, we feel an inclination to want that suffering lessened, right? So it's a wish to see relief for the suffering that we're seeing. And so this I would describe as an intentional element. So we notice suffering, um, we have an empathetic response, and then we want to see that suffering diminished or lessened. And then the fourth element is really motivation or action. And this is a really important piece. So we want to see that suffering lessened, and we actually do something to minimize suffering. And this is where a lot of people can get stuck. In some situations, there's really nothing that we can do actively to decrease someone else's suffering. And in those situations, the action can be self-compassion, because you've all experienced this before, I'm sure. Maybe even with your loved one. Um, they're experiencing some pain, and you've provided them with the prescribed pain medication. You've tried your usual tricks of, massaging their feet, or, holding their hand, and that pain's not going away. And that is a really challenging situation to be in as a caregiver. And in those moments, rather than staying in the distress of not being able to do something, we can turn towards self-compassion. So the action can be to hold our own experience of sadness, frustration, disappointment, that we can't do more to relieve their suffering. Then there's a fifth element to compassion, and that's what is often referred to as the warm glow. So it feels good to offer compassion to others, and it feels good to be able to hold your own experience or struggle with self-compassion. And this is an important piece, because this is the way we get conditioned to act compassionately. So since it feels good for us, and in fact, others who witness us acting compassionately, it's good to dwell upon that warm glow, that good feeling that comes. So I mentioned mindfulness in the context of the first element, awareness. And so I want us to work with this for just a couple moments. Um, we really deepen our awareness, not just of our surroundings, but our own self-awareness, when we can stop, when we can pause, and just take the time to be with what's happening right here in this moment. And because this is such an essential component of compassion, I feel like it would be good for us to work with this a little bit. So whatever your circumstances in this moment, you might be reclining, you might be sitting in a chair, you could be standing up. Some of you perhaps could even be walking, but allow yourself to come into a posture or a position. And if it's comfortable for you, and if your circumstances allow, you might even close your eyes for a moment and allow your attention, your focus, to go inward to physical sensations. And as we begin to settle, what we're doing is we're quieting the thinking mind, and we're really awakening what I like to call the sensing mind. So, what does it feel like for you to be in this body in this moment? You're just attuning, you're paying attention to sensations in the body. Perhaps you notice the pressure between your bottom and the chair that's supporting you. Perhaps you can feel your feet in contact with the floor if they're touching the floor. And begin to, if you haven't already, allow your attention to find its way to the in-breath and the out-breath. We're really just observing, not needing to change anything. If distractions arise, if thoughts come into your mind, you can just let those go and come back to the breath. So you're really noticing how you're doing in this moment. What is your present moment experience? What are you aware of? Okay, and as you're ready, you can open your eyes if they're closed and come back to the slides. Um, so this kind of awareness is how we really notice the quality of our own experience of struggle, difficulty, or suffering. And this quote, if your compassion does not include yourself, it is incomplete, is really quite relevant and important. There is this strong relationship between um, the extent that you're able to feel compassion for yourself and the extent to which you can feel compassion, I would say genuine compassion towards others. Now, for many of us, probably most of us, it's easier to feel compassion for others than it is for oneself. And this is completely natural. I think it has a lot to do with, the culture that we live within or the society that we live within where, we're sort of trained or conditioned to um, really exert ourselves, to work really hard, to not be weak. And often, unfortunately, um, compassion is associated with weakness, but it's really a strength, I would say, um, because it does include this action piece. And it takes a lot of courage to really express compassion for others, but also for oneself in the midst of their suffering. Um, so, um, the capacity to generate warmth and to self soothe plays a really important role in emotional regulation, in how we're feeling emotionally in any given moment. So, there have been a number of studies that have shown that the more we can self soothe, the more we can generate warmth for our own experience, the better we feel generally. The greater the sense of well-being that we have moving through our lives. So this cultivation of self-compassion is really cultivating this ability to self-soothe. And I like to think of it as a form of coaching that we apply for ourselves. And it can really get us through difficult situations more readily, more easily. Um, one way to think of this is what would you say to a friend who's struggling through some situation? Very naturally, you would be supportive, you would be kind, you would remind them of their ability to get through this and their strength. And we can turn that kind of encouragement towards ourselves. So there's a common issue of people being too hard on themselves, as I kind of alluded to earlier. Perhaps not doing enough, not being smart enough, um, perhaps thinking that you could be kinder when you experience a moment of unkindness. And I think it's fair to say that most of us engage, if not constantly, from time to time, in negative self-talk. And um, we should normalize this. It's not unusual. A lot of us do this. I know I do it all too often. And in these moments when we can apply self-awareness and we notice that we're engaging in negative self-talk, then it's helpful to bring a questioning voice that perhaps says something like, wait a minute, these are just my thoughts. These are not me. I don't have to believe these thoughts. It's not objective reality. Um, we don't have to believe our own thoughts. There's a great bumper sticker that it's something like, don't believe everything you think, right? Well, when we're thinking negative thoughts, we can actually interrupt those thoughts with self-compassion. And the practice that I'm going to introduce you to in a moment is a way of interrupting those experiences of negative self-talk and replacing the negative self-talk with self-soothing. One of the big problems in one of the big problems with negative self-talk is we get caught in kind of a cycle, repetitive cycle where we can't let go, and the negative thoughts generate negative emotions, and we keep repeating the thoughts, and it keeps triggering the emotions, and we begin to feel really, really lousy about ourselves. So it's a really useful tool to be able to interrupt those thoughts and shift into self-compassion. So the more self-critical and negatively we judge ourselves, the more stressed out and unhappy we are in our life. So it's useful to practice these these ways of applying self-compassion, and it really is a practice. Um, it takes time and it takes trust, I would say, that over time, those moments of self-doubt, struggle, self-judgment will become lessened by the practices of self-compassion. So one thing that's kind of interesting to think about with self-compassion, it really requires that we're simultaneously uh, being aware of our own suffering and being the one that addresses suffering. So it's kind of like acknowledging that in this moment I'm suffering, and there's something I can do about this. Um, so recently, a couple months ago anyways, I was experiencing a pretty significant health challenge in my life. I live with a chronic illness, and it really got away from me, and I was confined to a bed for about 2 weeks, and I was in a great deal of pain. And at that time, there wasn't a whole lot that was really helping. I was on pain medications, and I was looking forward to a procedure, but I was really, really suffering a lot. And I found in the worst moments of that, the only thing that was bringing me any kind of solace was to just hold my own experience in self-compassion, to be kind to myself in those moments, and to remind myself that being human means we're simply going to suffer. And it's part of being human. But at least in those difficult moments, I can be kind to myself. And I'm convinced it really made a difference. It makes a difference. Um, so I've given you a lot there, but let's go ahead and practice a little bit of this self-compassion. Next slide, please. There you go. Okay. So what are the elements of self-compassion? Well, the components are the same as compassion, as I mentioned, but when it comes to self-compassion, we're going to focus in on three. And so there's the awareness of suffering that I mentioned earlier, but this shared common humanity. And that's what I was just referring to. So what does that really mean? The acknowledgement that being human means we're going to struggle from time to time. And sometimes our struggles are really, really intense and profound, and other times not so much. But it's also an acknowledgement that although our individual circumstances may be different from others, and we may feel very alone and isolated in our caregiver role, there are other people out there who also are in similar situations. And so, in a sense, I'm not alone. I share this aspect of common humanity. And that can be quite comforting and bring solace when we're having a difficult time. And then the third element is kindness. So, kindness toward oneself. In this moment, at the very least, I can direct kindness towards myself in these difficult circumstances. So let's try this out. And you'll see for yourself if it helps or if maybe things stay the same. I'm pretty confident it won't make anything worse. So once again, just allow yourself to come into a posture where if you're sitting in a chair, you're sitting upright, and if you can, you're closing your eyes if your circumstances allow for that. And once again, just we'll begin by letting our attention find its way to the breath. Just breathing in and breathing out. Not needing to change anything with the breath, but just noticing. We can simply rest our attention on the subtle sensations around the nostrils, around the mouth. Perhaps we can feel the air coming in at the back of our mouth, or the gentle rising and lowering of the chest or belly. In this moment, nothing to do but simply follow the in-breath and follow the out-breath. Sometimes it can be really helpful to count the breaths on the exhale. It helps anchor our focus, our attention on the breath. And from this place of stillness, from this place of calm, I invite you now to think about a recent or current experience where you have felt perhaps overwhelmed or you've felt yourself struggling, you've noticed your own suffering, perhaps you were asked to do something that you didn't feel as though you had the time to do or didn't know how to do, or maybe you said something that you regretted saying. Maybe you strained yourself physically by doing something. Maybe in this moment, you're experiencing some big emotion that feels a little overwhelming or uncomfortable for you. But allow yourself to notice what comes up for you as you're recalling or experiencing this kind of dis-ease or discomfort. And you can regulate the extent to which you're willing to go into the emotions of this experience. Remembering who's involved in the situation, where did the situation take place. Just allow the circumstances to come alive for you. So, staying with the experience, if it's comfortable for you, I invite you to place a hand or both hands upon your chest over your heart and let yourself sense into that point of contact. What does that caress, that touch, that embrace feel like? And whether your hand is upon your chest or not, you could say silently to yourself, this is a moment of suffering. This is a moment of suffering. So in this way, you're bringing mindful awareness to your experience. And you could try different phrases, something that feels more suitable or more genuine to you, but just acknowledging the moment of difficulty. You might say, wow, this really hurts. Or this experience is really hard for me. So being aware of and even getting curious about this experience of difficulty. What are you feeling in the body? What emotions come up for you? What stories do you tell yourself about this experience? And then remembering this piece of this element of common humanity. And although your circumstances may be unique, recognizing that others suffer just as you do. And in this sense, you're not alone. Of course, you are the only one living your exact life. You're the only one who's involved in these exact circumstances. But recognizing or acknowledging that you're not the only one who knows what suffering feels like. So you might say silently to yourself something like, suffering is part of life. Suffering is part of being human. And again, finding the words that feel true to you You might say something like, even in this suffering, I recognize that other people may feel this way too. Or something like, in this moment, I too can feel my connection to others who suffer. But this acknowledgement that we are part of this shared common humanity. And then, um, if your hand is upon your chest, feeling that warmth that could be emanating from your hand, and the quality of caring that's expressed by this simple gesture. And allowing yourself to feel all the kindness that you can, directed towards yourself. Each of us knows what it feels like to direct kindness towards a loved one, towards a small child, toward an animal companion. And now this is a moment to take that kindness and really mirror it back at yourself, to direct it to yourself. And you might, in the spirit of this kind of kindness, say something like, may I be kind to myself. May I be kind to myself. You could also ask yourself, what do I need to hear right now to express kindness to myself? It might be, I can do this. I can get through this. I am a kind person towards others and myself. May I learn to accept myself as I am. May I give myself the compassion that I need. Perhaps it's even, may I forgive myself. And now, releasing these phrases in a difficult situation and coming back to the breath. You might even let your hand or hands rest once again in your lap. And now notice what it feels like once again to be in this body in this moment. Noticing the breath, but perhaps even scanning the rest of the body, just checking in with oneself. What do you notice? Does anything feel different? And we'll take another couple breaths. And I'll sound this meditation bowl, and if your eyes are closed, you can open your eyes and we'll come back to the screen. So, this is the self-compassion break, and I want to, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. I want to acknowledge the work of Kristen Neff, who is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, who's done a lot of work around self-compassion. And this particular phrasing of the self-compassion break comes from Kristen Neff and her work. And I'll also mention she has a really wonderful book titled Self-Compassion, which I highly recommend. She has a newer book which is more focused on the unique needs of women when it comes to self-compassion, but I encourage you to check out her work. So what I love about this self-compassion, this wisdom tradition, this practice that is really as old as we are as humans on this planet, um, it's quite concise and it's quite handy. And it can be applied um, even in the midst of doing an activity. We don't necessarily have to stop and close our eyes and put our hand or hands upon our chest, but we can remember these three elements and coach ourselves in this way. And this can be a wonderful immediate intervention, but I also want to acknowledge that, when we talk about self-compassion generally, we can look for ways to integrate into our life, uh, you know, healthy self-care practices. And I know all of you have heard a lot about self-care, and you may be rolling your eyes in this moment, but um, just finding the opportunities to simply pause and rest, if not with the self-compassion break. A really nice self-care practice can be, um, you know, a moment or two of mindfulness, as we did earlier. And in fact, some recent studies have shown even pausing long enough to follow 3 deep intentional breaths can really calm the body and calm the mind. So when I think of self-care, this is one way I think of it, in addition to all the other things you've heard about, eating right and getting exercise, etc. So finally, I'm going to start to wrap up here. Self-compassion really does make us better caregivers. So if you're someone who is really focused uh, on the care for your loved one, like so many of us are, you might need to be reminded that the more we can take care of ourselves, the better care we can provide to our loved one. So self-compassion is a wonderful practice because it really builds our resilience, and it really sets us up to stay in the role in a healthy way for longer. So another way of putting that is it can ward off burnout, and I would say even exhaustion. So I hope you don't feel like taking this kind of time for yourself for a compassion break is selfish in any way, because it's not. The stronger you are, the more resilient you are, the better you can care for your loved one. So um, I'd like to transition now to, and we can go to the next slide. I'd like to transition to any questions that you might have. And I understand that you may have been putting things into the chat. If you haven't yet, I encourage you to. And I have a feeling Kelvin may have a question or two, which I'm happy to address, that came in earlier.
Yes, thank you, Roy. We do have a couple questions. One caregiver wanted to know if you had any advice for someone who's been a long-term caregiver whose loved one has just entered into long-term care.
Hmm. Yes, thank you for that question. Um, these kinds of transitions are really challenging. Um, they can be so loaded with so many different emotions, um, so much self-doubt around, is this the time or not? Could I have done more for my loved one at home before making this transition? Am I giving up? Feelings of guilt can come up for people. And so, I think it's really, well, I would just go back to the self-compassion break. Now, we want to be discerning and we want to give time to considering these big questions around timing and what our ability is and what's the best way to make sure that my loved one is safe. That's all really important things to think about. But sometimes those thoughts, that kind of thinking, can take over. And we may not even notice that we're stuck, we're swept away by our obsession with trying to figure this out or think our way out of the situation. We may find ourselves stuck in rumination or regretting that we didn't do something earlier that we could have done. So I would go back to what I was saying earlier, and that is, it's really nice to interrupt those circular or repeating thoughts with self-awareness, the compassion break, by using mindfulness to go into the body, to notice what's happening right here, right now. And when we interrupt those thoughts, we feel more control. And then I would say also that, a big challenge is, finding your peace now with the new circumstances. How can you be a better friend toward yourself now that you're living on your own? How can you support yourself with these kinds of practices, the self-compassion practice, but in support yourself with different ways of building your emotional resilience and keeping yourself physically healthy so that you can continue to visit your loved one wherever they're living. And now is such a complicated time because of COVID, and you may not be able to enter into these places. But mostly, I have some other ideas, but I think what I'll limit it to is try the self-compassion break and see if it shifts anything for you as you're in the midst of this transition. And I don't know who asked that question, but I hope it goes smoothly for you. And I hope, well, I wish you comfort and ease as you get used to this new normal.
Thank you, Roy. We have another listener who actually a similar situation. But in this case, there were a caregiving team. It was two siblings taking care of their mother for more than a decade.
Mm.
But then the brother recently passed away. So the caregiver is wondering if there are any techniques or recommendations you might have um, for daily care for this caregiver who's now going to be taking on, if nothing else changes, twice the burden
Mhm.
that they were before to take care of their mother, but also take care of themselves.
Yeah, thank you for that. Wow, it sounds like a really challenging situation to be in. Um, well, apart from the practice of mindfulness, and apart from the self-compassion break, I would introduce something else, and that is a practice that I use that I really that I really like quite a lot, that has really supported me, is to work with intention, not attention like we worked with in the meditation, but intention. So, what does this look like? Waking up in the morning, you might ask yourself, how do I want to show up today? Who's the person I want to be today for my mother, for my loved one? And come up with a really short, concise intention, something like, may I remember to take breaks throughout the day just to follow my breath. Something really simple, something that doesn't set you up for a failure. And then you can touch back into that intention throughout the day and see if that makes a difference. Um, there's a lot of practical ideas, not that these aren't practical, but ideas related to, resources in the community, but I'm going to limit my response to kind of the emotional realm, if you will. Um, and, be really kind to yourself. This is going to be really challenging. And, be clear on your boundaries because I'm so sorry for your loss of your brother dying. But if something happens to you now, what does that mean for your mother? So you're entering into a time where you could say it becomes even more important to take better care of yourself. Um, and although it's challenging, that may mean, finding more opportunities to practice self-care and to tend to your own needs. Um, yeah. So it looks like we have another one coming in. Let's see. I'll go ahead and read this one, Kelvin. In your experience, is it effective to remind friends and family members of your loved one and of yourself that you need a break from caregiving once in a while? My spouse is suffering from severe mental illness that got triggered by the pandemic. If I don't regularly reach out to friends and family, there's very few people offering to visit or take him out somewhere to give me a break. In addition, the cries for help often go unnoticed, therefore don't yield any results, even if I do reach out. If you think it's important to outreach, how do I do it in an effective way to solicit health and therefore get a break from myself? Yeah, wow. So thank you, GM. I'm assuming those are your initials. Thank you for sharing that situation. Sounds extremely challenging, and I've heard this from a lot of family caregivers. This kind of scenario. Now, this may feel like a stretch, but I'm going to go for it. Um, it may be important to generate some compassion for those friends and family who aren't reaching out because they may feel reluctance or fear of saying the wrong thing. Um, they may be reluctant because they don't know what to do. They don't know what to say or do. And so that may help you better understand why they're behaving in this way of not reaching out and helping. And then I would encourage you to ask, but without attachment to the particular outcome that you may feel like you need from them. That may be challenging, but this may give you permission to simply ask, understanding that they may not be able to show up. But your clarity in asking may help them to better understand what it is that's needed and even push them into circumstances that may be a little bit uncomfortable for them. And that would be okay for them, I would say, because the need is so great that we need to do this in communities. And so, what can we do to invite or encourage people to help us out? And then I often will say, how do we prepare ourselves for not getting what we want, right? And that takes us back to the self-compassion and the mindfulness, in addition to taking steps to avail yourself of some of the resources that exist in your community. But I just once again want to mention that I have seen this situation with other family caregivers So this may not bring much solace, but you're not alone in this one. So I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Roy. I think we have time for just one more question.
Okay.
And this person wanted to know, in terms of building compassion. So, does building compassion for ourselves, in terms of being a caregiver and those around us, improve caregiver life expectancy?
Um, yeah, I love this question. So I didn't bring with me any of the research to cite, but there's some really fascinating research that looks at the benefit of cultivating and practicing compassion on, heart health and in general health. And I'm sure all of the viewers can appreciate the relationship between, what we're thinking in any given moment and how our thoughts impact our physical health, that mind-body connection. So, one of the things I love about practicing compassion generally and self-compassion in particular is that, it really is an embodied practice. It brings us into the body. And so for so many of us, we live our lives from the neck up. We're really kind of stuck most of the time in our thoughts and in our head. And when we drop into the body through mindfulness or compassion, we may notice things that we can address more quickly. Um, you know, the practice of compassion is really beneficial. And one thing to keep in mind is that there are three beneficiaries, and it's beneficial to us and our general well-being and our health, but of course it's beneficial to the person we're expressing compassion to. But the thing that's fascinating is that studies that have looked at different parts of the brain that are activated when witnessing compassion find that the same effects take place for someone witnessing an act of compassion that take place for the person expressing it or receiving it. So that's a long way of saying that, yes, I'm convinced, about, both through my own experience, but through the research that's been conducted lately, that there's a really strong linkage between one's physical health and the practice of compassion. Yeah.
Thank you, Roy. And just before we go, I want to make sure to ask you, could you just let the viewers know a little bit more about the Zen Caregiver Project, what you do, if you offer any classes, and just kind of, I guess, talk about that.
Thank you. Yes, we're a small nonprofit based in San Francisco, and we have a wonderful volunteer program that sits with people who are in palliative care settings. But so much of our work these days is supporting family caregivers with these types of practices. So really focusing on how mindfulness, compassion, what I like to call death or loss awareness, maintaining healthy boundaries, mindful communications, etc., how to apply these practices in the midst of caregiving to really build emotional resilience and to be with other caregivers in the sessions that we offer. So it's easy to find us. We're zencaregiving.org, and we are always offering courses. You can talk to your health system. We like working with health systems to come in and provide courses, and they can contact us. But thank you, Calvin, for that question, because we really want to get these practices out there into the world to support family caregivers. And I really want to thank everyone out there for the work that you're doing and for caring enough about yourself and your loved one to show up for this session. So it's been an honor to be with you here today.
Thank you, Roy. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Our FCA webinars, we do these every month. They are free. Next month, we're going to be talking with Jocelyn Dublin about the Mind Diet, which is a way to promote brain health and to hopefully stave off the effects of cognitive decline. You can find out more about our website, our webinars on our website, just caregiver.org. So thanks again for joining us and spending your morning, your afternoon with us. And thank you, Roy, for sharing your expertise with everyone today. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
So it is December, so I think on behalf of myself and I know Roy, we'd like to wish you a very happy holidays, and hopeful new year, and hopefully a peaceful one at that.